If you could just describe what your purpose is within the Confederate Veterans, but before that, tell me how you came to be a member of it and describe what the organization is all about.
Well, I'll start with the organization. Sons of Confederate Veterans was formed in 1896. It was a direct spinoff of the United Confederate Veterans, which of course was a organization of actual Confederate veterans post-war.
It seems to me that by 1896, a lot of those guys were getting old, especially for those days, and the thinking was to sustain it by having a secondary chapter that was their descendants, correct?
That's correct. They both endorsed and blessed as their descendants organizations. These Sons of Confederate Veterans actually was originally known as United Sons of Confederate Veterans, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy were both sanctioned by the veterans themselves in 1896.
Tell me what it has represented in the 20th century and up through the present to you.
Well, it has its primary purpose is given in the charge given to us by General Stephen D. Lee in 1896, which was to use Sons of Confederate Veterans. Our purpose is to sanctify, perpetuate the memory of the Confederacy.
Why was the Confederacy formed in the first place?
Well, you would have to take that back practically to the Revolution. The arguments between North and South, the cultural divide, the Puritan intolerant spirit of the North, the Southern independent streak, lots of cultural reasons for it. A lot of that was set aside in the Revolution to try to those divisions of culture and
what do you consider
perspective.
some of the primary cultural divisions to be, and do they persist today?
Well, obviously you had the more important ones would have been political division of you obviously in the North had the Hamiltonian elite type mentality of a strong nation. In the South, we were led primarily by the Jeffersonian Democrats with we really don't even want a government, but if we have to have one, we want it very strict and limited. We want home rule as much as possible. We're getting rid of a king. We don't need to set up. One of my favorite quotes from a movie is when you watch The Patriot and Mel Gibson's characters at the South Carolina Secession Convention, and he says, "Why should we trade one king 2,000 miles away or something for 2,000 tyrants 1 mile away?" That's very much the sentiment that I think wraps up the Southern thought of politics and government.
The mission of the Sons of Confederate Veterans is primarily wanting to preserve the legacy of the way of life of South then, or the honor of the ones who fought in the war?
Our purpose is to honor the veterans. We are, however, in a sense, we're forced into dealing with the other issues because of people wanting to demonize the soldiers as fighting for an evil cause. So therefore we find ourselves having to be aware and having to be knowledgeable and to deal with the political, social, economic issues that put those soldiers into the field. Slavery was beneficial really only to the elite. Was not very beneficial, in fact would be a competing factor against the lower classes of white Southerners.
If you think about the Sons of Confederate Veterans honoring the fighting man, the average fighting man was just a scratch farmer who didn't own anything but what crop he could survive on.
That's right.
So all those hundreds of thousands of guys dying and they didn't own any slaves.
They were fighting for their turf.
If they said that the Sons of Confederate Veterans are a white supremacist, racist organization, what's your response to that?
Well, I'm very sarcastic and jaded to that accusation at this point. I simply say when somebody says, does it bother you to be called racist or whatever anymore, I'm like, that just means I don't agree with these people. That's thrown out so casually, so cavalierly at this point that it's really lost all meaning. I mean, you can be a racist and be a black person now for standing on the wrong side of politics.
Majority of Confederate veterans, they were doing nothing any different than Washington and his troops repelling an invading force on their turf. Is that how they saw the war? Same thing?
They would have seen themselves exactly. They could
That's
have,
the point.
Abraham Lincoln was King George III in their mind.
Right. What's it like for you in your gut and in your heart and in your soul to see this going on in your backyard?
Well, having been somewhat of a visionary and seeing where we were headed a long time ago when people said that could never happen, I'm a little bit more prepared for it mentally, but it's still very sickening. It's very sad. Frankly, where I see the country going, if I'm correct as to where it'll be in a few years compared to where it has come now, everybody is going to live to regret this.
I mean, really, it does inarguably reflect what the process was in communist China, with now the Cultural Revolution, the purging of the past, make it as though it never existed.
That's exactly what it is, and that's why I say it's a Marxist movement, because it's actually following that playbook.
Why do you think this is happening in this country now?
Well, you've got a crisis of values, really. You're into almost a post-Christian America. Those values have slipped away in the last couple of generations. The denigration of men, despising the strong man. Seeing a strong man up on a horse, what did they do in Richmond? They brought in a statue mocking Stewart with a transvestite, feminized kind of guy with breasts riding a horse in the same style.
What is the most common misconception as to why the Confederate States seceded?
I would, of course, in this day and time, and it's emphasized every day, would think it was that the state seceded because of slavery. My father, at the age of 5 or 7, when I became aware of the world, reminded me that the war between the states was fought not for slavery, but for states' rights. But I remind my people quite often that one of the rights the states wanted was to have slaves. So we have to do a perspective on that. The other answer to that is we have to remember, you said 3%. The highest I've ever heard is 25% of the people who fought for the Confederacy had slaves. I choose 7 to 10% as, who knows, but a more accurate thought for me.
And so, like all wars, other than World War II, say, it becomes kind of a rich man's war, and there was a lot of animosity in the Confederacy about that.
Rich man's war and who paid for it, but poor man's war who died. And the problem is, I think, with the North, people are like, oh, it's all about slavery, and they don't want to think about the fact that this war was fought in our backyards. It's here. The North doesn't deal with that.
And so the point you're making is the fact that the war was fought here in the Shenandoah Valley and elsewhere in the South, that tends to stick to you more generation to generation than if you're 1,000 miles away in Boston.
Yep.
And so you want to preserve what was being fought for, and most of all, who died.
Yes, heritage. I said it to my group one time. If these people would just leave us alone and let us honor our heritage and our ancestors, we'd be happy. We're not pushing anything on anybody. And I'm grateful, thankful to say that in all these riots and destruction, the name of the Sons of Confederate Veterans has never been brought up. Charlottesville, for example, that was never involved in that. So that makes me very happy. And I continue to remind my people, my members of the camp, quite often that we are Southern gentlemen and we have to maintain that. Well, they assume we're all laborers and, white trash and rednecks, and they don't realize that life is a little bit more complicated than that, and people are deeper. The older you get, the more you tend to think about your family and your heritage. And who wants to think that your ancestors did something horrible? You want to support the fact that, very simply, they rebelled against a government they thought was overpowering or out of line, and they fought to preserve their home and their families.
Both as a Southerner of over a couple hundred years and as a Vietnam veteran, how does it affect you when they desecrate the Confederate cemetery right here?
Well, of course it hurts me deeply.
As a veteran yourself, in your mind, is a Confederate veteran an American veteran on the same level as a Vietnam veteran?
Yes.
And so if you desecrate a Confederate veterans cemetery, it's no different than desecrating a cemetery with Vietnam veterans or a Vietnam veteran monument.
I agree.
Well, if you ask someone in 1860, where are you a citizen of? It was your state. People affiliated themselves with the state and not the federal government. Who I'm descended from, Daniel Wilson, who fought in the war, he didn't own any slaves. To be honest, I haven't looked at the data, but he was from Floyd County, which I doubt had too many slaves in the entire county. The North didn't want to stop slavery. There were no slaves brought into the U.S. on a ship with a flag flying from a southern state. They were usually New York or Rhode Island. Rhode Island, such a small state, but yet they had a lot of money and power because they were one of the bigger slave traders. So they made money on slaves.
And furthermore, when they were persisting with the war and instituting a draft from North as well, people don't realize there was a major riot in New York City in which bands of people roved around and attacked blacks, burned a black orphanage, burned black neighborhoods, saying, "You're the cause of this problem. We don't care about you." So, for the average Confederate grunt, with his single-loader musket, going to war, what was he fighting for?
Well, I would say there's a variety of reasons. One is the fact simply, like my ancestor, he was from Virginia. Virginia was asked to make a decision as to go fight South Carolina or be on their side. We chose that side, and he fought for Virginia. I'm not going to say he ended up fighting. He was in the Confederate Army, but was he fighting for the Confederacy or was he fighting for Virginia? Don't know. But the other thing is, I think a lot of them just simply, this isn't right. We were formed, and the agreement was if we didn't want to be a part of the bigger picture, we could separate.
Bigger picture being the federal government.
Being, yes, the union of all the states.
Tell me what the Confederate flag represents to Democrats or more left-leaning people and the media in America today. How is the Confederate flag perceived and misrepresented?
Well, I think it's real simple. Those on the left, when they see that flag, they think of one thing, and that is, if I'm carrying it, I want to have slavery. That is what they think. You know, that's
What about white supremacy?
yes, yeah. That's all they see in that flag. There is within the Sons of Confederate Veterans some people, and it's been coming on for a little while, but lately it's picked up a little more steam. Some people are saying, let's change our logo, because that battle flag was strictly a battle flag. It was so that the generals standing up on the hill, seeing a group of men coming from this side with all the smoke from the battle, are they our guys? Or are they their guys? And neither side could figure it out. And so some people within the organization want to change our logo to include the first national flag. The Confederacy, being a country, to be more representative of the Confederacy, using the national flag would be more appropriate. How the battle flag became the standard, I don't know. But today there is some talk that maybe we need to change it, because that flag alone just boils the blood of some people because they don't understand it. I have a bumper sticker that says, I would rather be historically accurate than politically correct.
So here you are with a law degree, you're a practicing attorney working on a PhD in history at a major university. Why are you a member?
I'm a member because I want to honor my family who fought, and the fact that the heritage of the South it is not about slavery. It was about the states being able to do what they pleased. And if they wanted to secede, they should have or could have. If you express any sort of support for what went on in the 1860s for the South, you are immediately labeled a racist. Therefore, any thought you have is discounted and you're not worth talking to.
Describe what you consider to be why the Confederacy was formed, why the Confederacy existed, and what its purpose was, and why it got into the Civil War.
I think a lot of it come down to economics. The North was screwing the South. They were taking taxes and taxes and taxes, and the money was going to benefit the North. It was not going to benefit the South. There was but one reason for the war. Lincoln invaded the South.
Why did he invade?
The money from the taxes that he was not getting when the states seceded, there was no tax revenue. And Virginia voted, I believe, twice not to secede. When Lincoln called for troops from the states is the time Virginia seceded. They said they would not fight their fellow southern states. The winners write the history. And Lincoln couldn't tell everybody he was waging a war over money. And the winners write the history. It sounded a whole lot better to tell everybody we're going to free the slaves than it was we can't do without the tax revenue from the states that seceded.
What's your understanding of the makeup of the average Confederate soldier? What was his life? What was his economic standing? What was his motivation?
Very few were of privilege. Most of the soldiers were, as in my case, just poor dirt farmers.
Grandfather.
Yeah. And they joined because the North invaded their homeland. That's why they joined.
See, now history's revising it and saying, oh, there was this ideology that they wanted to fight for the South and protect slavery. They didn't want to leave their home and fight.
They got drafted.
Exactly.
My great-great-great-grandfather that died in Elmira was drafted.
What's your response to accusations that the sons of the Confederate veterans must all be populated by white supremacists?
It's populated by people that want to honor their Confederate ancestors. That's what we're about.
Would you consider yourself a white supremacist?
Not at all.
Why not?
Just because I'm a person live and let live. It don't make any difference to me what color you are or what nationality you are or anything else. Just live and let live.
A current accusation, as well as being white supremacist, is Lee and everybody that fought under him and everybody in the Confederacy were traitors. Respond to the accusation that Confederate veterans were traitors.
I don't understand how they could be traitors. The Confederate States had the legal right to secede. It was built into the Constitution. They chose to secede. They were a separate country. It's very annoying to hear it always referred to as the Civil War, which at times I'll say so somebody understands what I'm talking about. It was not a civil war. It was a war between two countries. The North invaded the South. The South was independent. So they couldn't be traitors because they belonged to another country. The Confederacy wasn't trying to capture Washington. They weren't trying to take over the North. They wanted to be left alone.
Right.
They seceded from the Union. They formed their own country, and they just wanted to be left alone. See, up until this year, we had a Confederate memorial, had been having Confederate Memorial Day services at Woodbine Cemetery in the Confederate section.
Why did that stop?
It's sad this year we chose not to because we didn't want to bring attention to the Confederate section of the cemetery.
People would go in and desecrate it.
It's got marble monuments up there that we've replaced a bunch of them, identical monuments, marble, and it doesn't take a lot to break them.
The state has pulled funds for maintaining Confederate cemeteries.
Correct.
What do you think the motivation for them doing that is?
Appeasement,
Politically?
political appeasement.
To describe and discuss what is the Sons of Confederate Veterans?
Well, it's a fraternal organization that essentially requires its members to have a father, which is, there are no more of those, but have a grandfather, great-grandfather, or direct male lineage to a Confederate veteran. People can't seem to think today that people actually wanted to honor their fathers and their brothers and their sons who did not come back from war. Many of their bodies were never recovered. They were laying in some field without even burial. And so that statue on the courthouse lawns became the statue or the memorial for those sons, fathers, and brothers who never came back home, because there was no grave for them to lay flowers on. And it seems to me that some people today believe it inconceivable that someone would want to erect a memorial to their fallen soldier because they died for their home, they died for their land, and it wasn't to put down a race. And so we
So
see
like-
this.
Go ahead.
We see the same thing today with Vietnam War veterans. There is an increase in monuments to the veteran of Vietnam. And why is that? Because the Vietnam veteran is dying off. And their final days are waning. They're fading away, as General MacArthur would say. And so just as the Confederate veteran faded away, they wanted to be in the memories of those that they left behind. Those that were left behind wanted to honor that service. And it just galls me to think that we're going to remove these monuments, these memorials to men who gave their lives for their state, which they considered their country.
And you're making a wonderful point as a veteran yourself, is those monuments are not erected to memorialize the 2% or 3% who owned slaves.
Yes,
Those monuments are memorialized strictly from a military respect standpoint
that's
of the fighting man.
exactly right.
So I want to start out by asking you, please describe what you consider the Sons of Confederate Veterans to be.
Well, it's an organization dedicated to preservation of our cemeteries, to make sure the tombstones are kept up and also repaired or replaced if they need to be, and to make sure that the correct history and the truth is told about what the people in the South and my family, I know what my family went through, and to make sure everybody else knows that, and to give it a more personal interpretation and something that's a lot closer home.
You just made the point that you have Native American blood on one side. And so that kind of counters the idea, since you're proud of that, correct?
Right.
That you're a white supremacist because you're in the SCV.
Couldn't be further from the truth.
Exactly.
And my great grandfather Weaver, John Weaver, they said he was tall as a tree and broad as a house. He was a big man. Enlisted in the 5th Infantry with a black boy down the road. They grew up together. They enlisted in the Confederate Army together. Now the black boy had more means because his parents were servants on a farm, and they had more means than my great-great-grandfather. The black boy had a sleeping bag and a whole bunch of gear and everything, so they shared the sleeping bag through the whole war.
They did?
Yeah. Well,
So
yeah.
they enlisted together and they were in
Yeah.
the same unit?
Yes. And they drove they called them caissons. They drove them, and they also drove supply wagons, and they also fought in the infantry. Both of them.
Did they both survive?
They both survived.
Did they come home together?
Yes.
Did they remain close through the rest of their lives?
They married sisters.
How much poverty was your great-great-grandfather in?
Very much. They were hand to mouth. They had to just eke out a living off the land. They did not get any help, and they toughed it out and survived the best way they could. Sometimes the slaves who had extra food in the wintertime, because they were well fed, taken care of, on the big farms, they would actually give food, extra food out to free blacks and free whites who had to fend for themselves.
What you said about your pride in your Native American heritage counters the idea of white supremacy.
Yeah.
This also counters the idea that everybody who went to war for the South was defending slavery. That's the last thing your great-great-grandfather was doing.
That was not on their mind at all.
One of the points I make to people is that it's not the sons of the Confederacy, it's the sons of Confederate veterans.
Right.
Tell me about the emphasis, your great-great-grandfather as an example, tell me about the emphasis of the organization on the veteran rather than any ideology.
The organization, which is what I like about it, is that they are focused on the men that fought and the veterans that served, and a lot of them that got killed, died. Many more died than were actually shot and killed because of disease and everything. The medical profession was very primitive at that time, very brutal, and those men had to endure such horrors. And there's no way they would have endured or went through any of that just so a few handful of rich people could have slaves on a plantation. That was not at all what they were fighting for. They were fighting off an invasion that they saw, and as they saw firsthand what that invasion, as the war drug on, if they had any qualms about fighting and wanting to stop right then, well, they saw where they were burning their houses, they were burning their farms, they were destroying their crops. Well, they had to fight that much harder. And
if I can respond to that, the point we make is that with your heritage being here 250 years, where you're coming from is what you're saying. It was about defending your land.
That's what it was. There's an old John Wayne movie. It's called Undefeated. And John Wayne attacks this Confederate unit, a small Confederate unit. And of course he defeats them real quick. And the old man that was head of that unit in Texas, John Wayne goes up to him, he says, "Sir, Lee, don't you know Lee's already surrendered? Why are you still fighting?" And the old Confederate says, "'Cause you're on my land."
It seems to me that the South was originally okay with doing some tax paying because it's understood that's part of business, but when
Yes.
the North overstepped,
Yes, they did.
they were
They
exploited.
did, yeah. They were exploited. The South felt that the North was exploiting them,
Right.
and they just wouldn't see eye to eye. They wouldn't talk to them about it. There's a lot of bad communication on both sides, and sometimes,
Like today.
yeah, like today. But when the bankers of New York and the financial people and industrial people went to see Lincoln after the South was starting to secede, the states were pulling out, they went and told Lincoln, "Hey, we're going to go broke, so you got to do something. You're just going to have a war. You're going to have to declare war on them and send troops and get them back, because we're going to get control of this thing, or we're going to go broke, and your government is not going to have any money to operate on. So you don't have any choice."
So they were after that cotton revenue.
Yep. It was a war that was just killing our own people off for the money interest of the North
Of the elite.
and the elite, because that's what they were doing. They were getting butchered off for the elite.
And here's the other fact, is that at the height of the war, when there was high desertion among the Confederacy because they had to go back and save their families, and it wasn't worth fighting this war anymore to them,
Yeah.
the wealthy cotton owners continued to plant cotton, but they didn't allocate crops for food for the survival of the people still at home. And the Confederate soldiers were getting desperate letters from home saying, we don't have any food, we're starving, you gotta come home.
Yeah.
That was the conflict.
And they were starving, and that's what happened to my great-great-grandfather's family.
What happened?
He had to desert, I think. He didn't really desert, he just told him he had to go in the spring
Go back
because
home.
he had to go back home and help plant. They just made them all go in. They didn't want to go in, but they made them. And they had the draft. They were going around. People in the north were trying. The northern states were trying to get out of the draft. South too were trying to get out of fighting because they really didn't want to fight against each other. They were made to fight by the moneyed elite, and it was horrible. It was so sad, and it was, as far as I'm concerned, it was evil.